Okay, so this is the first layer of our abridged atmosphere. Of course, we're approaching it in the Impressionist style, so it's going to be very much a direct painting methodology. I think more than in any other subject matter, painting from front to back is really important. So I start with the sky. And you'll notice I'm using a big brush, and I'm not painting, left to right. I'm painting patches. And I'm adding a little bit of phthalo blue to the ultramarine mixture that I started with. Adding some more ultramarine and phthalo blue together. And what I'm looking for is just some variation. You can see there's a little bit of variation in value. There's variation in temperature. And here I'll even put some violet in there. And yeah, I know you can't see it in the sky, but again, temperature variation in painting is a very important thing, as is cleaning your brush. So that's the first plane. And now I'm going to move into that distant set of trees and hills. So the hills come first. So I'm mixing up kind of a gray color and leaning it cool with blue. And I'm going to add some more hills. I don't like that single hill there. It's not that I mind a single hill, it's just I'd like to see some more hills. And actually there's a point of view of this landscape where you're more to the left of that barn and you can see many more hills. But I wanted the barn in the painting. So that's why I took this angle. So I'll just invent some mountains in the background. Now I'm mixing up a darker green for that distant set of trees. I can see already that it's probably going to be too intense. You can see I'm overlapping some of the hills with it, moving up into the sky. I'm not thinking of my brush strokes as leaves. I'm thinking of it as clumps of trees. So each brush stroke represents a tree. You'll see how that works out later. And you'll also notice that I'm kind of working green and a darker gray. It's not quite black. The black will be reserved for the foreground, maybe for that big clump of trees to the right, but definitely in the barn and in the fence. You'll also notice that I'm kind of fighting at the edge between the mountain behind and the trees themselves. Who knows, I might decide later to make it just one mountain. Maybe I'll just make it more prominent. Now I've got this kind of tannish khaki color. It leans a little green, and it looks a little dark because it's against the white. But remember, as we cover more of the canvas, it'll look lighter. And of course, this is just a complementary mixture, yellow mixed with purple, and then some white. And that gives me that kind of dry grass look in the background, because we're approaching winter now, and fall, sorry. So that's going to kind of burn the grass, if you will. It's had a hard summer of a lot of sun. Notice how I do the foreground, then I go back to the trees, then I do the foreground again. So again, that push and pull at the edge. So, here it's overlapping the background. There's parts where the the field is overlapping the trees. Now I'm pulling the tree color down into the brown, and you can see how that softens that back edge at the tree line, and it gives you some modulation of dark and light in the grass. Now I'm painting that big clump of trees. So I'm painting a much darker color, and I'm instead of just using single brush strokes as a tree, I'm using kind of broader brush strokes as clumps of branches or of the boughs, clumps of the leaves within that larger set. There's probably about 3 or 4 trees clumped together there. Now I'm looking for that kind of reddish wheat, I guess it is, or some sort of weed. I went too blue, so I browned it up. Of course, it's overlapping that grove of trees. Notice how my strokes go up. Think plant. Your plants are growing up vertically. Now, they may not all be straight in their verticality, but they are moving upward towards the sun. Notice how I've turned my brush on its side, and I keep reloading it with that reddish brown over the dark. Again, dark first, then light. And then adding more white to get little glints of highlight in there. A little bit of green at the bottom to reflect. And then I'm going back to my khaki and overlapping the base of that. So again, drawing that grass up over that wheat so that the space is actual, not edge to edge, but overlapping. Experimenting with a little bit more green in the trees. I don't think I like it, so I give up and move back into the foreground. You can see I'm intensifying the color a little bit more. Now I'm pulling back on my reference, putting some more of those little stands of reddish wheat across that upper third of the painting as I move into the middle third. Now I'm leaving some gaps of white. I'm lightening up, creating a shift in that hill as it comes forward by adding white. So it goes from dark to light. So that looks pretty convincing distance-wise. I want you to also notice that I'm not painting individual blades of grass. I'm creating clumps that move upward. Now I'm mixing that kind of reddish maroon for the barn roof. And notice I let it mix with the underlying color. And to get it deeper, I just add more color, stack it on top. But what's nice about it is that it is mixing with that color, and that gives it a little bit of a relationship with the colors that surround it instead of it being stark and different. Yes, I see brush strokes, but this is Impressionism. You should see brush strokes. Now I'm painting the shadows inside the barn. So I'm not painting, the wood. I'm painting the shadows underneath the wood or in between the wood. So I've mixed up a dark gray, again mixing complements, no black. And back to my red for that secondary roof. Again, pushing and pulling at the edge. It's not a puzzle. Putting some more green down. Coming towards the foreground with a much more vibrant green. And obviously this green is probably a little too vibrant, but I can modulate it down later. And here I do paint a little bit more, I guess, with a mind towards individual blades, but not too much. Because if you look at the foreground photograph, or the foreground of the photograph, you'll see that it really isn't that defined. Now I've got a lighter gray, and you can see why I did the black underneath, because now I have the little lines in between those slats of wood. And the wood mixes in with the black, which gives me a shadow towards the right side, which is present in the photograph. I'll lighten it later with some white. Now I'm about to skip ahead. I did some significant work in the foreground, but in order to advance this demonstration, I went ahead and just kind of jumped forward so that we could get through this a little bit more quickly. So you can see I've got a little bit more intense green and a little bit more intense brown towards the foreground. So, just increasing the hue by upping the amount of red or yellow, or I guess orange is what I'm kind of going for. At the same time, the green is a little bit more intense. a little less brown, a little less khaki colored than what we see in the background. That said, there's really no intense green except for in the very foreground. Again, notice that all my strokes are kind of upward and large. I'm not painting individual brush strokes. Now I'm mixing up another black because I'm going to continue with looking for my darks. And I see that in that back tree there's some pretty significant darks. And of course in the barn there's some significant darks. I want you to notice that I'm not just using one black. I'm allowing my black to be a little redder, a little yellower. It's that temperature variation that I think really makes it more dynamic. You can see the grass is a little darker here, so I just paint wet into wet with that black that I have. Same with that outcropping, but just smaller marks. So like the last painting, marks within the existing shapes, not marks over. I feel like I can see more light and shadow variation in the background, so I'm going to test out this not quite black. It's dark. I still think it's going to be too dark, so I'll probably have to adjust it down later. I also wanted this hill to come forward a little more, so I test out a darker color, too gray. I want it to be more blue, so I add more blue, too gray still, more blue. There we go. So that helps that hill to come forward. And if you look at the photograph, it is very blue. And then I pull my trees right back over. So I painted over the trees and then the trees back over the hill. Now I'm painting, the grass that I see in that window. Painting right over the black. It doesn't matter. You can keep it loose. We'll tighten up in a second. So like I paint those slats and then pull grass in front of the slats. I'm not worried about the edge being uneven. We can straighten that up later. All I'm worried about is the slats. And notice how, just by virtue of painting over that black, which is still wet because I put it on so thickly, and that's one thing, you just keep putting paint down and put it down thickly. That wet into wet, it's called Alla Prima, wet into wet. Much different than the dry layering. But it really allows for some really interesting light effects when you smear that gray into the black. It gives the barnwood a much more weathered look. Putting some shadows under the roof. I'm using a smaller brush now too, which is going to help me to get a little bit more detail. Notice I'm pulling the trees behind the wheat on top of the wheat, and then I'm pulling the wheat back on top of the trees. As fast as I'm painting right here, it's not that much faster. You want to be quick. Now I'm mixing up some lighter grays. Putting some more details. And you can see I'm straightening up the edge now. I'm painting those slats, the gate, obviously too thick. I'll come back in between them with black to thin them out. Some more grass textures. Look at how, by putting down grass in a kind of overlapping fashion, it really gives it depth. But again, don't get too self-conscious about the brush strokes. There I am putting the black in between those slits. A little blue, I'll fix that later. it's dark. That's the most important thing. Actually, I think right now I'm putting some red over it and then pulling white back over it. Red to make it more violet. Little touches of a lighter tone. If you're really painting alla prima, you're going to get a lot of blending, and you're going to have to just keep kind of, I guess, shoveling paint in there. But the beauty of that is you get mixtures you couldn't have possibly imagined on your palette, which is a good thing. So that's about where we want to leave off. And as you can see from this photograph, it's not all covered. There's still a lot of white left. It's loose. We don't have a lot of the tertiary details. Those will come later when we get into layer 2, which of course will begin on the next class. So until then.